when it comes to voting on civil rights legislation. Well, the filibuster is not mentioned a single time in the Constitution. It is too...
Interruption. Thank you. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the cloture vote on the motion to concur be at 8 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. I appreciate the courtesy of my colleague.
Senator from New Mexico.
We had no choice but to do it at 6:30.
So the importance of us being here today goes right in the face of having this conversation and have debate. And I appreciate my Republican colleagues who've come to the floor to engage in some debate and some colloquy. I, like Senator Kaine, came to the Senate a bit naive. I thought debate happened here all the time. I came here thinking that I could offer an amendment at any time, that I could offer a unanimous consent at any time. It's not the case. This is not the Senate that our founders envisioned. Now, if you feel moved to oppose a piece of legislation, if you're passionate about an issue, you should have the courage to come to the Senate floor in front of your colleagues and the American people. You should not be allowed to phone it in from behind closed doors. This chamber has changed, just as the times have changed. So it's the responsibility of every one of us to make sure that the Senate works better. Not for us, but for the American people. Now, in closing, in 1805, Vice President Aaron Burr suggested that the Senate remove from its rules the previous question motion, which allowed the chamber's simple majority to end debate on a bill. He viewed the rule as completely unnecessary and urged the Senate to clean up its rule book because after everyone spoke and debated, they'd vote. A year later, the Senate removed the previous question motion, leaving a loophole that allowed the minority to take advantage and use what we now know as the filibuster. Unfortunately, Burr could not foresee the obstructionism of decades to come. In the following decades, pro-slavery senators co-opted the filibuster to protect the interests of white Southern enslavers. Men such as John Calhoun abused the filibuster to obstruct civil rights efforts. And according to historians, between 1917 and 1994, 30 measures favored by the sitting president, simple majorities in the House and Senate, half of which addressed civil rights, they all died thanks to the filibuster. The same procedural tool proved to be even more useful to Southern senators who sought to block civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching bills. Not until 1964 did the Senate successfully overcome a filibuster to pass important civil rights legislation and subsequent voting rights legislation. Now, history should act as a teacher to all of us, and history will remind us who voted today on the side of the people. I'm proud that this effort includes my Native American Voting Rights Act, which will ensure tribes and Native Americans and Alaska Natives and voters on tribal lands will have equal access to the electoral process. Access to the ballot box is the cornerstone of our democratic system. And without equitable access to it, we cannot stand on the world stage and claim that we are all leaders in the fight for liberty and justice for all. Now, my Republican colleagues have proven time and again that they're not interested in acting on this issue. Washington Republicans have made the political calculation that they have a partisan advantage here. They are too comfortable shrugging their shoulders and sitting on the sidelines while states chip away at the right to vote. I know where I stand, Mr. President. All we are asking for today is the opportunity to vote on this critical piece of legislation after everyone here has said their piece. I urge my colleagues to do the right thing today, to do right by our democracy, and to send the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to the President's desk. I thank you all, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you. Our democracy is extraordinary because it is built on the bedrock idea that through free and fair elections, the citizens who make up this great country, well, they have a voice. that each person's vote truly matters, that in America, the people have the power. But at this moment, our democracy is threatened. Republican state legislatures and governors all over the country are writing laws designed to restrict the right to vote, make it harder for tens of millions of eligible citizens to cast their ballot, and silence the American people's voice in the process. Make no mistake, this is an unprecedented, coordinated attack to make voting harder for eligible citizens and make it easier for bad actors to sabotage our future elections. In my state of Nevada, we've bucked that trend when it comes to voting rights. We've strengthened the right to vote, providing easier access to the ballot box for eligible voters while ensuring fair elections. These measures that Governor Steve Sisolak signed into law include establishing a permanent vote by mail system, expanding the early voting period and making it more convenient to register and to vote. But while Nevada has moved forward to protect and strengthen voting rights, we are not immune from the attempts to sabotage it. In Nevada, the leading Republican candidate for our Secretary of State stated that he would have refused, I repeat, would have refused to certify President Biden's victory in our state, even though the results were certified by a Republican Secretary of State and unanimously upheld by the Nevada Supreme Court. That same candidate opened the door to certifying alternate electors in future presidential elections in Nevada, contrary to the actual election results. And in Nevada, the leading Republican candidates for governor are promising to undo our progress and make it harder for Nevadans to vote because they refuse to accept the results of the 2020 election. They're pushing the former president's false conspiracy theories that fueled the January 6th insurrection. Attacks like these, they're a growing threat to democracy, and exactly the reason we need to act urgently. If we fail to do so here and now, new state laws will result in hours-long lines at the polls, overturned election results, and masses of disenfranchised voters. So let's talk about solutions, smart solutions, solutions that give every eligible voter equal access to the ballot box. The Freedom to Vote Act, combined with the John Lewis Voting Right Advancement Act, meets this moment. It meets the moment we are in with our democracy in crisis. It delivers real, meaningful action. First, this bill makes it easy for people to register to vote. It does this by requiring states to allow eligible Americans to register online and on Election Day, as well as update our automatic voter registration system. This bill would also require states to accurately maintain their voter registration lists and protect voters against unwarranted purges from the voter rolls. This way, those who should be eligible to vote can do so without hassle or harassment. The Freedom to Vote Act gives Americans more choices on when and how they can legally vote through national standards for early in-person voting, expanded mail-in voting, and finally, making Election Day a national holiday. Because even if you're a hardworking American who's busy working long hours or looking after your children, caring for a sick relative, you should still have access to the ballot box. This bill would ensure election security and prevent partisan sabotage by requiring post-election audits and enhancing protections for election records. The Freedom to Vote Act would also take long-needed steps to end political corruption in our elections. It would accomplish this by protecting U.S. elections from foreign interference, by prohibiting false information designed to dissuade eligible voters, by promoting online ad transparency, and by putting an end to that dark money in our elections. To borrow a few words from the late Congressman John Lewis, my former colleague from the House, a legendary civil rights leader, an American hero for whom this bill is named, an inspiration to us all and to people all around the world. John Lewis said, and I quote, "The right to vote is the most powerful tool in a democracy." I'm going to repeat those words from John Lewis. Listen closely. The right to vote is the most powerful tool in a democracy. Each person's vote is their voice. It's every citizen's opportunity to weigh into what matters most to them, for their family, for their community, for their country, for the world. It matters. It is fundamental to our democracy, to the very definition of what it means to be an American citizen. For each and every one of us to stand up, to stand tall, to get to the ballot box, be able to vote the way we choose, and have the assurance that our vote is counted. It matters. Each person matters. And so, if the Senate cannot move forward on this critically important legislation under the status quo, then it is time to reform the rules to restore the Senate to pass this legislation. Because only then can we protect our democracy's future and secure the freedom to vote for every eligible American, for this generation, and for the generations to come. Thank you. I yield back.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to oppose the Democrats' federal election takeover. The president just gave one of his rare press conferences. It was only the second one he actually gave on American soil. The White House seems to think that the cure for Joe Biden's poll numbers is more communications from Joe Biden, and the press conference went on for 1 hour and 54 minutes. The White House doesn't have a communications problem. It has an agenda problem. The American people understand exactly what President Biden and Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi are trying to sell. The American people aren't buying it. Democrats don't need a message reset. They need a better agenda for the nation. What we're about to vote on tonight has nothing to do with the priorities of the American people. Has nothing to do with coronavirus. Has nothing to do with 40-year high inflation numbers, which are biting into the paychecks of the American people. It has nothing to do with the crisis at the southern border, where 2 million illegal immigrants have crossed the border this year, criminals among them, drug smugglers among them, gang members among them. It's nothing to do with what's driven the president's approval numbers to an all-time low of 40%, which it is today in the Gallup poll. Democrats' number one goal, they stated at the beginning of the Congress, is to pass a federal takeover of elections. An election takeover bill was the first bill they introduced. Democrats are ignoring what the American people are demanding so that they can do what their radical fringe is demanding. Democrats want elections to be run by Washington, D.C. instead of the 50 states. The Constitution is very clear. It says the states run our elections. Well, why do they want to take over our elections? Well, Democrats want to do things like banning voter ID laws. Now, 80% of Americans believe people should have to show a photo ID in order to vote. Senator Schumer has already twice tried to cram an election takeover bill down the throats of the American public. This is the third time. So far, he has failed. So why? Why has this continued to fail? not simply because Republicans oppose it. It's failed because the American people oppose it. The American people aren't looking for a federal government takeover of elections. A recent Gallup poll asked people what they think is the most important issue facing our country. Voting laws didn't crack the top 20. In fact, voting laws received less than 1% of the vote. It was an asterisk in the results. Democrats' scare tactics on voting laws have utterly failed. Now Democrats are so desperate to change our voting laws to their advantage that they're going to try to break the Senate. That's what they're doing now. The Senate is supposed to be, quote, the world's greatest deliberative body. Some Democrats want deliberations to end forever. Democrats claim they'll change our election laws and then they'll stop. One time only. Claim they'll only rig the game just once. Well, we all know that's not true. They can't resist the temptation to rig the U.S. Senate once. They won't resist the temptation to rig the rest of the government either. Once Democrats change the rules, there'll be no stopping them from doing everything they've ever dreamed. Pack the Supreme Court, add new states to the Union, amnesty for illegal immigrants, try to take away the guaranteed rights by the Second Amendment, you name it. If they could do it, sooner or later, they will. There's a bill in the Senate right now to add 4 new justices to the Supreme Court. 46 Democrats in the Senate have signed on to a bill for statehood for the District of Columbia. It's almost the entire Democrat caucus. Democrats have also introduced a bill to give statehood to Puerto Rico. These bills become law. Democrats know they'll get 4 more Democrat senators permanently. One change to the Senate rules, and America would have a permanent one-party rule. Don't take my word for it on amnesty either. Just months ago, Democrats tried to pass amnesty for 6.5 million illegal immigrants. That's greater than the population of 32 of our 50 states. Amnesty of this magnitude would permanently remake our electorate. New York City has already granted the right to vote to illegal immigrants. Democrats break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules. They'll pass amnesty as fast as they can. Over the past year, they have gone on record, they have sponsored the bills, yet they know that they have failed to persuade the American public to support this agenda. They know they'll never have bipartisan support to pass the radical amnesty for illegal immigrants, never have bipartisan support to ban voter identification, never have bipartisan support for taxes and punishing regulations that continue to drive up the cost of energy, never persuade the American people to support their radical, extreme, dangerous, and scary agenda. Yet, rather than change the agenda to comply with what the American people want, the Democrats want to change the rules. So desperate for this radical agenda, they're willing to destroy the Senate. Democrats have a long list of partisan bills that they'd like to pass. All of these bills have 2 things in common. They have nothing to do with improving the lives of the American people as the American people see it today, and they give more power to the Democrat politicians in Washington, D.C. Let me remind my colleagues that there is an election in November. In the last election cycle, 7 Democrats ran for president saying they would change the rules of the Senate. They all lost. Democrats who said they'd change the rules lost key Senate races in swing states, including Montana, Maine, and Kentucky. American people have spoken loud and clear. They don't want to see this Democrat power grab. American people want us to focus on their priorities. It's up to them to tell us what's important to them. And what we're hearing loud and clear from the American public, it's coronavirus, it's inflation, it's national security, it's crime, it's securing the border. Not a bigger power grab for politicians. The Democrats in this body seem to have forgotten the people that they were elected to serve. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Who seeks recognition? The senator from Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. President.
President and colleagues, as today's debate begins to wind down, I want to rise to join those who have called for the passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Years ago, when the United States was in the early stages of conflict in Vietnam, I was fortunate to win a Navy ROTC scholarship to attend Ohio State. During my freshman year there, as spring break approached, our commanding officer called in a bunch of us freshmen, midshipmen, to send. He said, "I got a deal for you. How would you like to have an all-expenses-paid trip to Quantico, Virginia over spring break?" And that's where the Marine officers trained after going to college. We all raised our hands and said, "Count us in." On the way, one day off, we had 5 days in Quantico and more. One day off, we took a train to Union Station in Washington, D.C., just 3 or 4 blocks from here. And from there, most of my fellow midshipmen found their way to watering holes in Georgetown. I chose to visit Capitol Hill. It's a place I'd never been. That day, I walked up Delaware Avenue and past this building, somehow find my way into the Rayburn House office building, just a short distance from where we're gathered today. I walked up to a security officer there and asked if there are any hearings underway that I might try to sit in on. He said, "Yep." He directed me to a long line leading to the House Judiciary Committee room. And after a long wait, I finally had the chance to find a seat and watch in person the debate over what would later become the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I was glued to that seat for hours, mesmerized by what I said and what I heard. Later, back on the train to Quantico that evening, my friends asked me what I had found on Capitol Hill. And that day, and I told them I thought I may have found my future. And as it turned out, I did. That day and in the days to come, those hearings, inspired by the civil rights movement, forced a spotlight on the discriminatory state laws that had made it nearly impossible for many Black Americans to vote 100 years after the end of the Civil War. Years earlier, my sister and I had grown up in Danville, Virginia, the last capital of the Confederacy. There, we saw racial discrimination up close and personal. Even as children, we knew it was wrong, and we knew it had to change. Sitting in Rayburn years later, I found the place where I thought, just maybe, I might be able to help do something to right that wrong. Nearly 18 years later, since sitting in that hearing room, after I finished my studies and completed my 3rd deployment to Southeast Asia as a naval flight officer during the Vietnam War, I found myself back on Capitol Hill and these halls, this time serving alongside of John Lewis and the House of Representatives. And after years of blatant discrimination and voter suppression, specifically targeted at Black Americans, we began to witness change. It came slowly at first, and then more quickly. Thanks to the tireless efforts of people like our friend John Lewis, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gained increasingly popular bipartisan support over the years. In fact, as we heard earlier, by 2006, the vote to extend the Voting Rights Act was unanimous. Imagine that, 98-0. Think about it, 98-0. And today, 16 of the Republican colleagues who voted for it, among those 98, are still here. Given that history, however, it's almost unbelievable to think that the right to vote is under attack once again in many parts of our country. Today, in states across America, state legislators and some governors are seeking to enact a wave of voter restrictions, many of them with the sole purpose of making it harder to vote, often specifically targeting Black Americans. In 2021 alone, 19 states passed some 34 laws restricting the right to vote. How? Well, by allowing partisan observers to intimidate independent poll workers in Texas, by pulling drop boxes and ballot applications out of the hands of voters and imposing penalties for poll workers in Florida who are just trying to do their jobs. In Georgia, it's okay to make the poll lines longer and longer, but you can't bring food or water to the voters who wait in them sometimes for hours to vote. Hours. We know that in many parts of America, black voters have to wait in lines for twice as long as white voters to cast their ballots. Twice as long. And in some places for up to 6 hours. That's not just morally wrong, and it's an assault on who we are as a people. How can we look at what's happening and not ask, for God's sake, can't we do better than this? Indeed, we must. Let me leave you with one idea that worked in 1965 and just might work again in 2022. You know, every day across our country, Americans gather in places of worship. Every major religion in the world relies on one common principle that bolsters our connection to each other. Golden rule. The idea that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. The idea that we ought to treat people the way we want to be treated. Most Americans would be surprised to learn that admonition is repeated almost weekly in multiple Bible studies and prayer breakfasts that are regularly held here on Capitol Hill throughout the year. It's a shared belief across religious, ethnic, and party lines that the person across from us is just as valuable as us, just as deserving of love and dedication as we are and our loved ones are. In 1965, the Golden Rule was a foundational principle for equality in the Voting Rights Act. Congress was guided by it. In fact, every major religion on this planet embraces it. I don't care if you're Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and it goes on. The Golden Rule is in your teachings, in your beliefs. And you hear it here in this body, in this building, week in and week out. Maybe, just maybe, it's about time for us to rely on it once again in this land of the free as we seek to connect our values and our faith to our actions. Most of us will recall that both Dr. King and the preamble of our Constitution called on us to work to make this a more perfect union and fulfill the promise of our founders that all men and women are created equal. And while across our country today, we're seeing a growing wave of voter restrictions, I'm reminded of what Martin Luther King said many years ago. He said this, he said, only when it's dark enough can we see the stars. Think about it. Only when it's dark enough can we see the stars. And sometimes it's only when we are tested as a nation that our true spirit shows itself. I pray that this is just one such time. So while none of us hoped to would ever face these challenges in our democracy, to our democracy in the year 2022, perhaps we can take some comfort in knowing that someone else has walked this path before us. All these years later, we feel that fierce urgency of now that Dr. King spoke of 5 years before, providing us both with a moral blueprint and the encouragement to do something with that. As I close, let me just say, having said all that, let me reiterate that this is not a time to wait and dawdle. Congress needs to regroup. When we leave this building this week, and then act with the same sense of urgency as an earlier Congress did in 1965 when it passed the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in order to better protect the sacred right to vote and uphold the sanctity of our electoral processes. The legislation before us today seeks to make clear what we as a nation aspire to be. It makes clear that no one who is eligible should be denied the sacred right to vote. Let me close, colleagues, by observing that in the end, we can quote Dr. King and praise my friend John Lewis until the cows come home. But when Americans' sacred right to vote is on the line, it's our responsibility to uphold our oath to the Constitution and get on with it. I don't know. I never knew Dr. King. I knew John Lewis, know him well, love him. But I don't know if Dr. King or John Lewis were fans of Mark Twain. I am. And I want to close by paraphrasing the words of Mark Twain. And this is that paraphrase. When in doubt, do what's right. You'll amaze your friends and confound your enemies. Well, friends, time has come to do just that, to do both of those things. And that's why no barrier should stand in the way of our sacred obligation to protect this democracy. And with that, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, the current voting rights proposals, or so-called voting rights proposals that the Democrats are proposing, are not about increasing access to the ballot box. According to the Washington Post, the 2020 election saw the highest voter turnout in 120 years, and 94% of the voters said that voting was easy. These bills are really a power grab that would circumvent and federalize our entire elections process, stripping states of their constitutional authorities. These power grabs would force taxpayers to pay for political campaigns, expand the practice of ballot harvesting, prohibit important voter ID laws, keep deceased people and those who have moved out of the area on registration rolls, and federalize election laws, which would violate the U.S. Constitution's clear directive that states administer the elections. To name just a few. Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution delegates election processes to the states. This is a union of 50 states. States are the best equipped to implement and enforce election policies that protect the integrity of all future elections. And although many who've spoken today would have you believe that the states across this nation are seeking to violate the rights of American citizens and restrict their access to voting, the laws that are being proposed and adopted by the states are doing just the opposite. They are helping to expand voter access and improve security at the polls. There are a lot of myths and untruths running rampant because the Democrats seem to want the public to think there is this widespread voter suppression in Republican-led states, which there is not. A couple of myths and the facts. Myth: Republican state legislatures are enacting laws that will roll back early voting. The fact is that the states are expanding early voting. Georgia's bill, for example, which has been attacked, allows for and provides for, mandates 17 days of early voting with 2 additional optional Sundays of early voting. The list goes on. Arizona allows 26 days. Iowa allows 20 days. Texas, another state that has been attacked, allows 17 days. The fact is the states are expanding early voting. Myth: States are implementing voter ID for vote by mail in order to disenfranchise voters. The facts: as vote by mail is increasing in the states, and the states are implementing some of the same safeguards that are used for in-person voting to ensure a secure election, such as voter ID, which the legislation before us seems to want to prohibit. Recent polls show that 80% of the people support being required to show ID in order to vote, including 62% of Democrats. Myth: prohibiting ballot harvesting and requiring people to vote in their own correct precinct constitute discrimination, outlawed by the Voting Rights Act. Fact: in a recent Supreme Court case, the court ruled 6-3 against this claim. Arizona law mandates that voters must vote in their assigned precinct, and those who vote early by mail cannot have anyone other than a household member, a family member, a caregiver, a postal worker, or an elections official collect their ballot. In other words, supervised ballot collection. This law effectively bans the practice of ballot harvesting. The Democrats seem to want to expand, even mandate ballot harvesting in the legislation we are being asked to support tonight. Myth: states are improperly purging eligible voters from their voter rolls. Fact: states are taking reasonable measures to ensure their voter rolls are accurate, which makes elections more efficient and fair. States are simply implementing a time-honored practice of cleaning up voter lists, removing voters who have died or who have moved or who have been declared incompetent by a court or convicted of a felony, a time-honored practice in many of the states across this nation. Myth: recent changes in Georgia to prevent people from giving bottles of water is inhumane and targets minority communities. Fact. The law allows poll workers to set up self-serve water stations for voters to use. The statute prevents political organizations from giving people in line things like meals, water, or gifts. Once again, this is a long time honored practice in our states. This law of anti-electioneering or anti-vote buying is standard practice in many states, including many of my colleagues' blue states like New York, New Jersey, and President Biden's home state of Delaware. So let's get on to the filibuster. The argument is, since the Republicans won't accept these wrong-directed reforms, so-called reforms of our election laws, that we should eliminate the filibuster in the Senate. That is the last thing that should be done in the Senate. President Biden himself has argued against eliminating the filibuster, and according to a recent report, Democrats used that filibuster over 300 times in 2020. In 2005, then Senator Joe Biden gave a passionate floor speech defending the Senate filibuster, saying that this is a key procedural tool and ending it would eviscerate the Senate and do a disservice to the country and would upset the constitutional design. In another floor speech, then Senator Biden further argued the reason Republicans in Congress were attempting to end the filibuster was because they controlled every level of government. He went on to point out that the reason to have the filibuster rule was so that when one party controls all levers of government, one man or one woman can stand on the floor of the Senate and resist the passions of the moment. Again, in 2005, Senator Chuck Schumer also said that eliminating the filibuster would be a doomsday for democracy. That would turn our country into a, in his words, banana republic. Former Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia wrote about preserving the filibuster. We've heard it many times today. He said, we must never, ever tear down the only wall, the necessary fence that this nation has against the excesses of the executive branch and the resultant haste and tyranny of the majority. He went on to say the Senate has been the last fortress of minority rights and freedom of speech in this republic for more than 2 centuries. And he said, I pray that senators will pause and reflect before ignoring that history and tradition in favor of the political priority of the moment. As Leader McConnell quoted on the floor yesterday, the smallest majority we've seen in our politics is trying to change the rules for how people get elected in every state. You may recall Republicans were asked to do this exact thing when we controlled every lever of government, and we refused to make that change because of the importance of the filibuster to this institution. Eliminating or weakening the legislative filibuster would destroy the intentional design of the Senate by the world's most deliberative body. It would allow any small majority in the Senate to strip the voice of millions of Americans considered in the minority. Removing the filibuster, the ability to filibuster legislation would reduce the incentive for the Senate to forge broad agreements and force further debate, and would likely increase divisiveness rather than efficiency. I urge my colleagues to vote against this federal takeover of our state's constitutional right to manage their own elections. And I urge my colleagues to reject this unfounded assault on the Senate filibuster. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont. Mr. President, this has been an interesting day of debate. It actually feels good to hear people really speak on an issue. As President Pro Tem, I've sat in that chair where my distinguished friend from Maine is sitting now as presiding officer. I sat there for hours today and listened to the debates and heard many I found extremely good, and then I heard some others. But I appreciate the fact that I had the opportunity as President Pro Tem to hear so many other senators in both parties speak. You know, I spoke yesterday about protecting everyone's vote on a ballot and how important that is. I know that because in my own state of Vermont, and when I first ran, it was a very Republican state. I've been on the ballot between my times as state's attorney and senator, between primaries and general elections. I've been on the ballot in Vermont 24 times. I never questioned that the ballots would be counted accurately and honestly, even though in several of the elections, 80 to 90% of the people counting the ballots were the town clerks and they were Republicans.
Could we have order in the Senate, please? Take your conversation off the floor. Thank you.
So after those 24 times, I think I have some idea of how the Senate works. And I can also say with seniority comes a bit of experience. This is my 48th year here in the U.S. Senate. Having been elected by those same Vermonters I praise for the way they protect the sanctity of the ballot 8 times. Still the only Democrat sent to the United States Senate by the voters of Vermont. I've become the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the former chairman and ranking member of the Judiciary and Agriculture Committee, and then honored 3 times to be elected as president pro tempore. So let me just take a couple of minutes with your indulgence, Mr. President, to talk about what the Senate was, what it has become, and what it can be again. I think my experience qualifies me to say that. My conscience compels me to say that. We each of us stand on the shoulders of giants, the senators from across the political spectrum, from around this nation to forge a path for America. They met the moment of the time not with timidity or fear, but with action, with decisiveness. Now, was the road taken an easy one? No. Was the struggle short? No. But was it worth the sacrifice, the dedication, the commitment, and yes, the compromise to meet it? Of course. But before the Senate today is the issue that's at the heart of our very government, the right to vote. The one thing we can hold sacred, no matter what party we belong to, the right to vote. Time and time again, the Constitution has been amended to expand the right to vote, not to restrict it, but to expand it. Look at the 15th Amendment, the 19th, the 24th, the 26th. These each gave greater access to the ballot box to more Americans. It furthered the shared goal that ours be the most exclusive and most democratic nation on earth. But today we do have a scourge of laws, no matter what we say on the floor. The facts are we have a scourge of laws making their way through partisan legislatures across the country. They roll back the tides of time, eroding the most fundamental right, all the time when technology and pure common sense should tell us that voting should be a lot more accessible than it is. And coupled with a challenge from the Supreme Court that Congress affirmatively act. Remember this, the Supreme Court said, why didn't the Congress step in there and act to restore the long bipartisan Voting Rights Act? There's no more important time than now for us to meaningfully address this constitutional right, this foundational right. Now, there's some honest questions to ask here of ourselves, of each other. Do we really want to make it more difficult for Americans to vote legally and safely? Is that what democracy means to you? To me? Do we really want to allow states to make it more difficult for blue-collar workers or the poor or the disadvantaged to vote when the great advances of time and technology are there where you can easily make it easier to vote, not more difficult? Are we really going to turn back the clock to an era where state and local jurisdictions can blatantly discriminate against certain voters, yes, people of color, minority populations, by simply rigging the systems of voting or counting or changing the map to erase the progress of generations, make meaningless the fights of lions like John Lewis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and so many others. Is that really what we stand for in this century? Were we elected by our constituents to flatly obstruct any action in this body simply because our party is not in the majority? Or were we elected to tacitly agree with a prescribed agenda? The Senate, those who stand in it, owe more to our constituents and to this nation than blind party loyalty. We owe it to the nation to do what is right. We owe it to our conscience to do what's right. Partisan disagreements, divisions, stalemates dot the pages of our young nation's history when you go back and read it. But it's the moments of bipartisanship that punctuate it. So I'd ask the question of our two leaders. Mr. Majority Leader, should we not have a debate, a real debate in these issues, with amendments unbound by deadlines or time limits? But in answering that, I also ask the Minority Leader, do we not have an obligation to Americans, your constituents and mine, to at least talk about these issues, offer honest and meaningful proposals, then vote them up or vote them down? Are we not intended to be the greatest deliberative body in the world? Probably was when I came here, but these days we surely are not. And history will remember this moment, a moment when we stood for the foundational right of our democracy, the right to vote, or we stood against it. Long have I said on this floor that the conscience of the nation rests in the United States Senate, or should. Today, each of us, is sworn to uphold the Constitution as a member of this great body, that we must examine our conscience. We must decide whether it be the politics of exclusion or the justice of inclusion that be the indelible mark of the 117th Congress. We must decide if the Senate envisioned by our founders can be restored. The giants, the lions of the Senate, are the members who rise above to meet these moments and have the courage to do what is right. If our job were easy, anyone could do it. But throughout history, fewer than 2,000 Americans have had the honor, the privilege, the responsibility to hold the title of the United States Senator. I've been proud to serve with 1 out of every 5 of those senators. Some I agreed with, some I disagreed with. I can say this, we, the 100 here today, are caretakers of a legacy far greater than our own. We shoulder the responsibility of a nation founded under the principle that governments are instituted among its people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And I fear that if we let this moment, this pivotal moment, pass us by with no debate, no action, no advancement, we'll not only be derelict in our duty, but we'll betray the very oath we swore when we stood in front of the desk you're sitting in, Mr. President, and we pledged to defend the Constitution, to continue the endless goal of forming a more perfect union. We should pass the freedom to vote, the John R. Lewis Act. But we should, at the very least, have the courage to debate it. I feel such a privilege serving Vermont. I feel such a privilege to have been on the ballot 24 times in our state, because I could always trust that everybody who wanted to vote could. Today, we have the technology, we have the ability to have far more people vote. don't we owe it to this country? Don't we owe it to our oath of office to do that? I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Another senator from Vermont.
All right, we're running out of senators from Vermont. I think that's it. Mr. President, let me begin by thanking a number of my Senate colleagues who have worked so hard on this issue. Let me thank, among others, Senator Merkley, Klobuchar, Booker, Warner, King, Leahy, Durbin, Kane, and others for their efforts on this important issue. Mr. President, I will be brief because there is not a whole lot that I can add to the excellent statements that so many other senators have made. But let me just say this. For some, the issue we are debating today may seem complicated, to be understood only by lawyers, constitutional scholars, and those handful of people who actually understand the opaque rules of the U.S. Senate. So I just want to say that if that is what you think, you're wrong. What we are debating today is not complicated. It is really quite simple, and here is what it's about. Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election, period. You may have liked that result, or you may not have liked it, but he won. He won in an election that Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security determined to be the most secure election in American history. After the election, Trump and his supporters filed more than 60 lawsuits in state and federal courts, repeating their false claims and trying to reverse the election results. These lawsuits were rejected time and time again, including with judges that Trump himself appointed. Nonetheless, the former president continued to claim, and to this day continues to claim, despite all of the evidence, that the election was stolen and that he actually won in a landslide. Not only are his statements and actions delusional, they are worse. In repeating this big lie over and over again, he not only cast doubts about the 2020 election, but in fact, in a disgraceful and unprecedented way for a president, he is undermining the very foundations of American democracy. Shamefully, Republican leaders all across this country, including Republican members of the U.S. Senate, either repeated Trump's lies or tried to walk a very, very thin line around them. Trump's one-man dominance over the Republican Party is now so strong that few Republican officials are prepared to state openly what they know in their hearts to be true. And that is that Trump is a pathological liar and a threat to democracy in this country and our very way of life. In any case, the predictable result of all of this was that Republican governors and legislatures all over this country saw Trump's big lie and fear-mongering as an opportunity, a golden opportunity, to solidify their political positions, acting under the guise of voter integrity, despite the fact that our nation has very little voter fraud, thank God. They proceeded to pass election laws in 19 states that make it harder for people to vote, with a special focus on people of color, young people, poor people, and people with disabilities, people who might be inclined to vote against them. In many cases, they also created election districts through extreme gerrymandering that have no rationale other than to make certain that Republicans retain control over state legislatures. In other cases, they are cutting back on the authority of independent election officials and giving that power to partisan legislatures. Today, in order to address this crisis in American democracy, members of the Senate will be casting two very important votes. The first will be the Freedom to Vote Act. And this bill goes a long way to end voter suppression and, in fact, make it easier, not harder, for American citizens to vote. It establishes automatic voter registration and online voter registration. It celebrates democracy by making Election Day a national holiday so that people can vote at a time other than after work. It establishes uniform early voting and same-day registration. This bill also ends partisan gerrymandering and roots out the undue influence of special interest money in buying election. Imagine that. Imagine that. We would actually know the names of billionaires who put huge amounts of money into super PACs that buy elections. What a terrible thing. We'd actually know who these people are. This bill would also provide increased protection in the voting process for voters with disabilities, the military, overseas voters, and underserved communities, and much, much more. This is a very significant piece of legislation. Now, why would anybody be opposed to it? Why, in a nation that has a history of denying the vote to African Americans, denying the vote to Native Americans, denying the vote to women, denying the vote to low-income whites, why would any fair-minded person be in opposition to make it easier for all citizens to vote? That's what I understood when I went to elementary school. You know, you play by the rules, you do your best. Sometimes you win, and sometimes you lose. That's the process. But no one ever told me that what politics is about is working overtime to try to prevent people from voting just because they might vote against you. Our job should be to increase voter turnout, make it easier for people to participate, which is what this legislation does. I want this country to have the highest voter turnout of any nation on earth, not one of the lowest. But let's be clear. This enormously important bill, a bill to protect the foundations of American democracy, will fail. It will fail because, according to Senate rules, it will require 60 votes to pass, and in a 50-50 Senate, not one Republican will vote for it. It will likely get 50 votes, which, with the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote, would be enough to pass this legislation under majority rule. It will not get 60 votes. All of which brings us to the second vote, which is really the most important vote of the day. That vote will determine whether anything we discuss today, whether any of the speeches that we give, any of the points that we actually make will in fact become law. And that is the vote to change Senate rules and establish a talking filibuster, a process which gives the minority an enormous amount of time to object to legislation and voice their concerns. The minority, whether it is a Democratic minority or a Republican minority, would have days and days and days to slow the process down, to rally the American people around their ideas. But they would not have forever. At the end of the time allotted, a majority vote would prevail, which in my view is what a democratic society is all about. Is changing the Senate rules a radical idea? Oh my God, First time in history we're about to do it. Never been done before. Oh, well, really, not quite. No, because every member of the Senate knows the rules get changed on a fairly regular basis. Nothing radical about it. Just a few months ago, in order to raise the debt ceiling and prevent our government from defaulting on its loans, the rules were changed so that a 50-vote majority would prevail. We changed the rules appropriately, and we prevented a default and a massive worldwide depression. Just a few years ago, my Republican colleagues who were so adamantly against changing rules, well, my goodness, they changed the Senate rules to allow 50 votes to confirm the president's nominees to the Supreme Court. Oh, my goodness, how shocking. And they got 3 conservative Supreme Court justices as a result. Rules get changed around here all of the time. And maybe, just maybe, we might want to change the rules in order to save American democracy. Now, let me conclude by saying this, and I don't know if any of my other colleagues have made this point, but I will. I regard it as a very sad day for our country, and I mean this very sincerely, that not one Republican in this body is prepared to vote for this bill. Now, I understand why that is the case. I am in politics. I got it. I know who the leader of their party is. But this I do not understand. I can understand Republicans, but this I do not understand. I do not understand why 2 Democrats who presumably understand the importance of the Freedom to Vote Act, and as I understand it, will vote for the Freedom to Vote Act, are not prepared to change the rules so that that bill could actually become law. That I do not understand. If you think this bill makes sense, and if you're worried about the future of American democracy, and if you're prepared to vote for the bill, then why are you wasting everybody's time and not voting for the rule change that allows us to pass the bill? You know, it's like inviting somebody to lunch, putting out a great spread, and saying you can't eat. If you're going to vote for the bill, vote to change the rules. Mr. President, if we can change the rules to prevent a default on our national debt, if we can change the rules to confirm Supreme Court justices, we can certainly change the rules to save American democracy. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Abraham Lincoln must be turning in his grave to hear the senators from the grand old party, the party of abolition and emancipation and Reconstruction, echoing the states' rights rhetoric of Dixiecrat segregationists to oppose federal voting rights legislation, to oppose even the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 2021, just 1 Republican senator had the courage and principle to vote to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the senator from Alaska, Senator Murkowski. Just 1. For decades, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was bipartisan. Today, only 1 Republican senator will stand up for this landmark achievement of the civil rights movement. Not Senator Cornyn of Texas, who previously said the Voting Rights Act is simply the most important and most effective civil rights legislation ever passed, bar none. No longer his position. Not my friend, the senator from Maine, Senator Collins, who previously said this bill will ensure that the voting rights afforded to all Americans are protected. Not Senator Burr of North Carolina, who previously said voting rights for all American citizens, regardless of race, are granted by the 15th Amendment and enforced by the Voting Rights Act. And not the minority leader, who previously said this is a good piece of legislation which has served an important purpose over many years, and this landmark piece of legislation will continue to make a difference not only in the South, but for all Americans and for all of us, whether we are African Americans or not. Not the minority leader. The same minority leader who said this bill eliminated the barriers to voting so that all Americans could participate in the basic opportunity each of us have. Who celebrated, quote, "We have renewed the Voting Rights Act periodically since that time, overwhelmingly and on a bipartisan basis year after year, because members of Congress realize that this is a piece of legislation that has worked." No more. Not in 2022. Only one Republican senator stood up to support the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When Congressman John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boynton and hundreds of others marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis had his skull fractured on that bridge for daring to demand the right to vote for Black Americans in the American South, it was the example of their courage and their sacrifice that paved the way for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As my colleague, my brother, Senator Reverend Warnock, has often observed, when Congressman Lewis passed, there were many in this chamber on both sides who rightly celebrated his towering achievements and his legacy. But I speak for the state of Georgia when I say, do not invoke Congressman Lewis' name to signal your virtue while you work to erode his legacy and defy his will. I've heard a lot from our Republican colleagues about the recently passed election law in the state of Georgia. Let's be very clear. There is no one in Georgia on either side of the aisle who doubts or does not understand precisely what its purpose is. Forbidding voter registration for runoff elections. Driving down the early vote period during decisive runoffs to drive up lines at majority Black precincts. As he used to say, John Lewis didn't give a little blood on that bridge that day so that Black Georgians would have to wait 8 times longer to vote than white Georgians. John Lewis didn't give a little bit of blood on that bridge that day so that state legislatures across this country could pass legislation surgically targeted to make it harder for some people to vote. All for partisan power. In the state of Georgia, where now partisan election officials can step in and throw out locally elected election boards to change who can vote and where they can vote. This in the aftermath of a well-known incident when the former president of the United States threatened Georgia's Secretary of State with criminal prosecution if he didn't, quote, find 11,000 votes that were never cast for Donald Trump. The facts of the former president's efforts to seize re-election despite his defeat are well known. He and his lieutenants mounted an unprecedented campaign to retain power based on a torrent of lies that have grievously wounded public confidence in our elections. And it was only thanks to the integrity of our laws and our courts and principled election officials and the will of Congress, the will of this Senate, Mr. President, to ensure the peaceful transition of power in the face of a violent assault on the U.S. Capitol, that this conspiracy was defeated. So now this faction seeks to dismantle precisely those bulwarks which prevented their onslaught from succeeding. The choice is ours, whether we will allow them to do so. We in the United States Congress, Madam Vice President, have the constitutional authority to make the laws with respect to the administration of federal elections. We in the United States Senate have an obligation to defend the legacy of Congressman John Lewis, to stand up for the sacred franchise, to secure equal access to the ballot for every single American voter so that this country can continue its journey toward full realization of our founding ideals. I yield the floor, Madam Vice President.
Madam Vice President.
The senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We have been summoned here by history. This is not just another routine day in the Senate. This is a moral moment in America. And I recall the words of that great American patriot and prophet, Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday all of us just observed. As he agonized over the difficulty and complexity of that moral moment, Dr. King said, "History has thrust something upon me from which I cannot turn away." We have been summoned here. All of us. We cannot turn away. And this is no time for politics as usual. The times cry out for moral leadership, for integrity, for empathy, and for care for one another. Deep investment in the covenant that we have with one another as an American people. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. What a grand doctrine. What a noble idea, which our country has been striving to reach with fits and starts, with setbacks and comebacks since the day of its founding. This is one of those moments. We cannot turn away. We cannot hide from history. And I am truly honored to stand here with all of you, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, in this moment. And on this, my 365th day as a member of the United States Senate, the most consequential deliberative body on the planet, striving again for greatness. I was elected from Georgia on January 5th. What an honor to represent the people of the state of Georgia. And what a great nation. A kid from the Caton Homes housing projects. The first college graduate in my family of 12. My folks are both preachers. They read the scriptures, be fruitful and multiply. But this kid who grew up in poverty, now serving in the United States Senate. Only the 11th black senator in the whole history of our nation. And during that same time, Georgia also elected its first Jewish senator, my brother Jon Ossoff. And I believe that somewhere in glory, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel are smiling because they marched together. Rabbi Heschel said that when he marched with Dr. King, he felt like his legs were praying. And so what a moment. I won after a hard-fought election. And the next morning, I was feeling pretty good. My mother, who grew up in Waycross, Georgia, picking cotton as a teenager, had joined with other Georgians in record voter turnout, and the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton helped to pick her youngest son to be a U.S. Senator. Only in America is my story even possible. I was on several of the morning shows talking about what the people of Georgia had achieved, and I was feeling pretty good that morning. Man, I was on The View talking to Whoopi Goldberg. But by lunchtime, the news alerts on my phone began to buzz. Something was happening in the Capitol. And we all know the rest of that sad and tragic story. A violent assault on our nation's capital, driven by the big lie. Ugly words, signs, and symbols of racism and anti-Semitism. An effort to stop the legal certification of an election, and in spite of those who want to hide, sadly, January 6th really did happen. And we must face up to it. We cannot hide from history. January 6th happened, but here's the thing. January 5th also happened. Georgia, a state in the old Confederacy, sent a black man and a Jewish man to the Senate in one fell swoop. Our nation has always had a complicated history, and I submit to you that here's where we are. We are swinging from a moral dilemma. We are caught somewhere between January 5th and January 6th. Between our hopes and our fears. Between bigotry and beloved community. And in each moment, we, the people, have to decide which way are we going to go and what are we willing to sacrifice in order to get there. The question today is, are we going to give in to a violent attack whose aim is now being pursued through partisan voter suppression laws in state legislatures? Sadly, Georgia, the same Georgia that sent me and my brother Ossoff to the Senate, not the people of Georgia, partisan state politicians, have decided to punish their own citizens for having the audacity to show up. And it isn't just about the restrictions around water and food distribution. The more fundamental question is, why the line so long in the first place? And why is that the case in certain communities? I know experience of so many of your fellow Americans. We need empathy. compassion, care for one another. While local election officials working in Lincoln County, Georgia, to close all but one polling location for a county that's bigger than 250 square miles. Why is the second most powerful legislator in the Georgia State Senate working right now to pass legislation to eliminate all ballot drop boxes in Georgia in the middle of a pandemic? Why are state leaders in Georgia right now working to take over the local elections board in Fulton County, where Ebenezer Baptist Church sits? There's a woman in Cobb County named Irish. She says she's tried repeatedly over the past 10 years to vote, but could not because of long lines and changing polling locations, people playing games. She said that she has often had to decide if she will work or vote. Another woman, Verona from Cobb County, says that she waited in line for 8 hours in the rain at her local library, 8 hours to vote. I run into constituents all the time who tell me that they waited for hours to vote for me. I'm honored that they voted for me, but I'm sad that they should have to wait for 8 hours. A student in Atlanta named Isabella says that she and many of her friends who could not vote in the November 2020 election because they did not want to skip class to stand in line. Why are state leaders in Georgia behaving as if giving voters these awful choices is normal, or that voters like these Georgians don't exist? Those are the facts of the laws that are being passed in Georgia and across our nation. And so here's the question tonight. America, are we January 5th or are we January 6th? Are we going to give in to the forces that seek to divide us by gerrymandering us, suppressing us, and subverting the voices of some of us in pursuit of power at any cost? Or are we going to live up to that grand American covenant, e pluribus unum, out of many, one? I choose what Dr. King called beloved community. I choose America. I choose a nation that embraces all of us. We've been summoned here. We cannot turn away. And in just a few moments, all 100 of us, blessed with a sacred trust, will let the American people know where we stand on the question of whether the Senate will protect their voices, the voices of the very people who sent us here, or if we will simply surrender to the anti-democratic fervor and polarizing disunity spreading across our nation. In the meantime, let me say that I am glad that we are finally actually having a debate on the Senate floor. Imagine that. The Senate, what is that? The most important deliberative body is actually having a debate. It took us nearly a year to get to this point, and I want to thank my colleagues who have worked with me and others over the last many months to keep this critical issue on the Senate's front burner. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights. The democracy is the framework in which all other debates take place. We can strengthen our infrastructure and the infrastructure of our democracy at the same time. If we can change the rules to raise the debt ceiling, we can change the rules to raise and repair the ceiling of our democracy. This is our work. And so we have crafted a strong piece of compromise legislation that will address the rampant voter suppression and election subversion laws we're seeing pass in state after state after state, 19 so far and counting. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act will restore bedrock voting protections established by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, protections that have been eroded by the Supreme Court and are born from an era where members of this body used to work together to solve the tough issues of our time. It will also set a federal baseline for voting standards to ensure every eligible voter has access to the ballot, no matter where they live, and to protect elections from subversion by craven politicians. Voting rights should be bipartisan, used to be bipartisan. Passed this body the last time, 98-0, signed into law by George W. Bush, a Republican president. And I know that my colleagues and I have worked in good faith this past year, this entire year. We have worked hard to try and find some common ground with our Republican friends on this issue. I've said to my colleagues, let us bring these measures to the floor to debate. Let's reason. Let's deliberate. And I had hoped our friends on the other side would have allowed us to have a debate on voting rights legislation, but until today, that's what they blocked 3 times in the Senate. They didn't block the bills, they blocked our ability to even have a debate on the bills. As a pastor, I understand the power and the possibility of coming together with those with whom we disagree, to have a robust debate on the issues that are important to families and to our country. I share with many of you, I'm sure, a vision of the Senate that collaborates and negotiates on the most important issues of our time. I believe in bipartisanship. When it comes to something as fundamental as voting rights, I just have to ask bipartisanship at what cost? Who is being asked to foot the bill for this bipartisanship, and is liberty itself the cost? I submit that that's a cost too high and a bridge too far. I'm deeply saddened that our Republican colleagues chose not to join us in this effort. Democrats would prefer not to act alone, but by all means, we have to act. Even if we don't get it done tonight, we have to keep working at it until we get it done. Dr. King's words are as true now as they were back then. History has thrust something upon me from which I cannot turn away. He said, justice delayed is justice denied. Now, I know that I've been speaking a lot over the course of the last year about voting rights. And it is one of my primary passions. But I'm thrilled to work for Georgians to close the Medicaid coverage gap in our state, to create new good-paying jobs in growing and emerging industries, to strengthen broadband across our state and more. I'm thrilled to fight for these priorities for Georgia because that's what Georgians sent me here to do, but they sent me with their votes. But how can we have productive conversations about the many issues affecting the American people, about lowering healthcare costs, about creating good-paying jobs, about fighting climate change, protecting reproductive health care, if politicians and states get to cherry-pick their voters and the people's voices are squeezed out of their democracy? How can we achieve real consensus on the issues that matter most if only some voters can be heard? Taking action to pass voting rights legislation is not a policy argument. It is about the democracy itself. Voting rights is how we address the deepening divides in our country by ensuring every eligible voter's voice is heard. And we as elected representatives have an obligation to protect their voice. So when it comes to the question of procedure and the filibuster, let me be clear. I believe that voting rights are more important than a procedural rule. And if taking action requires a change in the rules, then it is time to change the rules. When the times changed, we have always changed the rules. 160 times. And as we consider the filibuster, the name of the senator from West Virginia, Robert Byrd, inevitably comes up. His is an important perspective. But we shouldn't quote him as if he is scripture. In fact, he didn't always get it right. He said his greatest regret was filibustering the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Robert Byrd learned from history, will we? Now, Madam President, as I continue on what may feel like a filibuster, some point to Senate procedure, while others recycle excuses we've heard before. But as the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, I also know that all of these arguments against taking the moral action we're called to take are distractions. Consider this. There are some things you can do in this chamber with just 51 votes. Confirm a Supreme Court nominee, 51. Pass trillions of dollars in investments for our communities, 51. Pass massive tax cuts, mainly for the richest of the rich, 51. Confirm cabinet nominees, 51. Raise the debt ceiling, we found a way to do it the other week, 51. But it takes 60 votes to repair the ceiling of our democracy by passing voting rights legislation. I'm left to conclude that if the issue is important enough, the Senate feels compelled to act. Well, let me say that I believe that the democracy is at least as important as the economy. Recently, many of our colleagues have argued that legislation to protect voting rights somehow offends our federal system of government and amounts, they say, to a federal takeover of elections. Some of the same voices, ironically, who have extolled Dr. King's life this week have at the same time been working vigorously against the legislation we're debating today to protect the right to vote, and many of them have been channeling old states' rights arguments. Let the message go out. You cannot remember Martin Luther King Jr. and dismember his legacy at the same time. You can argue whatever side you want, but you do not get to argue both sides. I will not sit quietly while some make Dr. King a victim of identity theft. You do not get to offer praises and plaudits in memory of Dr. King and then marshal the same kinds of states' rights arguments that were used against Dr. King and against the civil rights movement. Please know that as the pastor of Dr. King's church, this argument evokes, I say really respectfully, it evokes some of the darkest moments in our country's long struggle for equality. When the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional, in Brown versus Board of Education, after a century of Jim Crow laws, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus did not argue that he supported segregation at all costs. He instead claimed that obeying the Brown decision amounted to a surrender of all our rights, he said, as citizens to an all-powerful federal autocracy. When U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond launched the longest filibuster in the history of the United States against a bill to protect voting rights, he didn't argue explicitly that black people didn't deserve to vote. He instead claimed that it was, quote, unlawful and unconstitutional for Congress to regulate the elections of the states. And during the Senate's 60-day debate on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the closing argument of the bill's opponents, led and articulated by Georgia Senator Richard B. Russell, was that it would, quote, strike down and destroy many rights and powers which, since the foundation of our government, have properly belonged to several states. Let's be very clear about this legislation. The states will continue to administer their elections. And of course, states have certain rights. But do we genuinely believe that states have a right to discriminate, to suppress, or to block access to ballot boxes for so many Americans? Although we have 50 unique states, we are also united as one republic. And what happens in one state can affect us all. When we elect our U.S. senators and our U.S. representatives, and when we elect the president, we must represent all Americans. We need every vote to count to maintain the integrity of our democracy. And so we must do this work. I support reforming the Electoral Count Act. That said, reforming the Electoral Count Act will do virtually nothing to address the sweeping voter suppression and election subversion efforts taking place in Georgia and in states and localities nationwide. It doesn't matter if your votes are properly counted if you cannot cast your vote in the first place. And so as I close, I want to appeal to all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, not just as a colleague, but as a pastor and as a man of faith. The American people have sent us here, and history has summoned us to this moment. We cannot hide. Whatever the outcome tonight, I still believe in us. I believe in the U.S. I believe in us. I believe that democracy is the political enactment of a spiritual idea, that we're all children of God, and therefore we all ought to have a voice in the direction of our country and our destiny within it. I believe that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire, for ourselves and for our children, and that our prayers are stronger when we pray together. And so a young Martin Luther King Jr. struggled all those years ago, and he said, "History has thrust something upon me from which I cannot turn away." Those of us who are students of Dr. King, I know I have often wondered, what would I have done if I were alive during the Civil Rights Movement? I know we would all like to think that we too would have had just a small fraction, just a fraction of the courage that it took for John Lewis to cross that Edmund Pettus Bridge. Well, for those of us who are fortunate enough to serve in the United States Senate in this moment, in this moral moment, we do not have to wonder. My God, he faced troopers on the other side crossing that bridge. We're talking about a procedural bridge. We don't have to wonder what we would have done. I submit that what we would have done back then, we are doing right now. History is watching us. Our children are counting on us. And I hope that we will have the courage to do what is right for our communities and for our country. The courage to cross this bridge, to do the hard work in this defining moral moment in America for the sake of the communities that sent us here in the first place, for the sake of the planet, for the sake of healthcare, for the sake of jobs, for the sake of being able to argue for the things that we care about. The courage to fight for one another. I'm still praying that we will cross that bridge. But if not tonight, we will come back again and again and again. Madam Vice President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, Madam President,
Majority Leader.
just for a minute, I want to first salute the amazing speeches by our two senators from Georgia. Georgia, which has been the crucible in our fight for voting rights, where the attempts to curtail voting rights seem most pernicious. To both of you, your erudition, your eloquence, your passion were amazing. And I want to salute our Republican colleagues who listened to the speeches and hope that those who weren't here will get a chance to review those speeches as well. Now, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the pending cloture motion be waived.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the following senators be permitted to complete their remarks prior to the scheduled vote: Senator Blunt, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Schumer.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam Vice President,
Senator from Missouri.
been on the floor most of the day today. I think I've heard virtually every speech given. I was reminded again, as the day went on, of really the broad-based talent of people in the Senate. I spent some time a couple of years ago, over a course of about 6 months, kind of watching individual senators and trying to figure out how they got here. And with only a couple of exceptions, I could figure it out. That unique ability to communicate or to explain things in a way that people understood them, or to appear to just know more than other people knew about things that people knew senators need to know about. And I was reminded again of the tragedy of how little we use that collected talent. There's absolutely no telling what we could do if we would decide, as 100 people who figured out how to get to the United States Senate, how we'd work together and solve big problems. And I think we all know where we are today, but I do hope, as Senator Schumer mentioned, that we listened to each other as people express different views. Certainly the Senate would be a better place if we spent more time on the floor listening to each other and talking to each other. Now, on this bill, I think we all know where we're headed. In my view, having watched election legislation for a long time, it seems to me this is just another version of an election bill introduced by Democrats. There's not much new in this bill. Both the Rules Committee, where I serve, and the Senate have already rejected this federal takeover election several times this year. Now, many of my friends on the other side said, well, why wouldn't Republicans just want to debate this bill? I don't think anybody said, why wouldn't the Republicans want to amend this bill? Because there was no opportunity to do that. We've been on the bill now for several days. Got on the bill, fairly crafty way to get on the bill with a 51 vote. Fine with me to be on the bill. But our friends on the other side decided there'd be no amendments on this bill. And I think Republicans from the very start sensed that this would be a bill where we'd get a yes or no vote on a bill that really would dramatically change how we pursue elections. Now, while it has a new name, it's more than 700 pages. It's nearly identical to the Freedom to Vote Act. It's substantially the same as the two versions that couldn't get 50 on that side of the S1. Very similar to the Senate bill, H.R. 1, and very similar, frankly, to the election bills that I've been watching for 20 years. And there's always been a different reason to do about the same Democrat-sponsored bill, House and Senate. After 2020, the reason was, well, the equipment is too faulty, and we've got to have more federal control of what happens in the states. After 2016, the reason to have a massive election bill was, well, there's just not enough security in state elections, and the federal government has to intervene in some major way. After 2020, even though the federal government didn't intervene in a major way, suddenly the elections were the most secure in the history of the world. Both parties alleged that at one point. And now we need to have this bill because some states are passing legislation that in most cases looks at the real outreach that they appropriately did for the pandemic and thinking in 2021 that the pandemic was over, thinking, what do we want to keep of what we did in that outreach? And what do we want to decide we should only do during a pandemic? I haven't found very many places, if any, that couldn't be easily explained, like postal regulations and other things, where the states that made changes and rolled back their pandemic outreach don't have more opportunities to vote now than they had in 2018, the last election before they should have done extraordinary things. Actually, one lesson we probably taught state legislators here is don't do anything to try to meet an immediate moment, because if you try to undo it, any of it, when that moment's passed, you'll get on what Senator Langford described as the bad list. He also did a pretty good job explaining that a lot of states that weren't on the bad list don't have nearly the opportunities to vote that the states that are on the bad list. You know, one of the things, I was an election official for about 20 years, including the Secretary of State for a good part of that. And I always thought that the diversity of the system was one of the strengths of the system. I thought, as President Obama did in 2016, that the diversity of the system made it really hard for outsiders or insiders to figure out how they could rig a national election. I still think that. This bill undermines really a lot of state voter laws that are pretty popular with voters, and we've seen that expressed even in recent elections in like New York City. Prohibiting voter identification for mail ballots would be one of the things that you wouldn't want to do. If you wanted to have mail-in ballots, you'd want to be sure where those came from. And frankly, you'd want to have an objective standard like your voter ID number or some other number that was uniquely yours than a subjective standard like how you signed your name when you were 18 as opposed to how you're signing your name when you're 68. That was one of the changes, by the way, in the Georgia law, which should have helped more people than not. This bill retains Senate Bill 1's mandate on ballot drop boxes, federalizes rules for redistricting. I think it chills free speech, requires felon voting. Now, why would anybody want to be against any of those things? There are reasons, frankly, to be against all of those things, but states make that decision for themselves. And in some states, it may work very well, and others, it might not. Of the top sweeping election administration changes in this bill, the S1 policies in this bill disrupt state efforts to maintain accurate voter rolls. Now, accurate voter rolls were seen as one of the great progressive moves forward, so you'd have some sense that the people who voted on election day were actually people who were supposed to vote, and also important to vote in that district. You know, if you just vote anywhere and your legislative district where you should have voted was decided by 4 or 5 votes, and you were one of those 4 or 5, suddenly that's a big disservice to everybody else. The bill would spend federal money to send federal money to campaign coffers at the rate of $6 federal for every dollar raised. It even goes so far as to add a second public financing program that would give people $25 in federal funds to contribute to House candidates. Now, This 6-to-1 match is only for House candidates. That may not be what the final bill would say if we pass this bill, but it's only for House candidates now. And of course, this federal money would be eligible to be matched by 6-to-1 other federal dollars. That's a pretty good deal. You give somebody 25 federal dollars and it could be matched with 6-to-1 other federal dollars. This bill sets up a framework that would result in, I think, every congressional district map likely to be drawn by federal courts. How many maps have we seen this time that were drawn by new improvements that the states made that didn't turn out to be, one, any better than the old maps, and two, wound up being drawn by judges? The John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Friend of mine, I served with him, I traveled with him, I laughed with him, I liked him a lot, I admired him a lot. The Voting Rights Act was 12 pages when it was introduced in 1965. The John Lewis voting right provisions here, which have a great name, but they're 120 pages. I voted to extend the Voting Rights Act, and I'd do it again. And I'd be proud to do it if it was named for John Lewis, but 735 pages, saying that if we don't vote for that 735 pages, somehow we're opposed to the Voting Rights Act or opposed to the heroism of John Lewis. I don't think so. Since it doesn't have the support to pass under the current Senate rules, the next thing we'll do is attempt to really gut the legislative filibuster to force it through. My Republican colleagues have spoken at length about the consequences of doing that, as has Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema just the other day. The justification rests on really a narrow basis that somehow the protection of the minority no longer matters. The danger of overturning 200 years of election administration by the state, I'm going to resist doing any of the quotes this late in the day that you've heard over and over again of our Democrat friends who just a couple of years ago were saying, or less than a handful of years ago, how critically important it was that those rules never be changed. You know, if Democrats eliminate the 60-vote rule for election legislation, there'll soon be no filibuster left. Today it would be carve out for the election administration. 3 or 4 weeks ago, it was a carve out for the debt, raising the debt limit. The next carve out would be for whatever seems to be important that day. The carve out won't work. I don't think really anybody here believes that any longer. This would be the first step in just eliminating an important distinction that makes the Senate a place where we have to think about what we do. It eliminates some of the chaos that occurs when you have a party change. In the past 2 decades, a single party has controlled both chambers of the Congress and the presidency 4 times, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. The Senate is what has kept the country from wildly going from one direction back in the other. We don't want to lose that. The disaster for our citizens, the disaster for our economy of not having that sense of having to think about this just a little bit before you head in another direction is what the Senate is all about. I certainly hope my colleagues today will not pass this federal takeover of election laws and will also resist the temptation to change the rules of the Senate. And I yield the floor.
Madam Vice President.
The Senator from Minnesota.
I rise today after hearing from my friend, Senator Blunt. I remember on January 6th, as all of you do that day, when he and I and Vice President Pence and 2 young women with the mahogany box filled with the last of the ballots up to Wyoming took that long walk through the shattered glass, the spray painted statues, and we did our jobs. And I will be forever grateful of what he did that night and what so many people in this chamber did. But for me, it didn't end that night, because sadly, what wasn't accomplished by the people that rifled through these desks and got up on that dais, Madam Vice President, what wasn't accomplished with bear spray, what wasn't accomplished with the bayonets, and I still remember the blood on the officers' faces, sadly, has continued on. The votes that we took that night were important, but the votes that the people of this country take in every election are just as important. And that's why when you look at the Freedom to Vote, the John R. Lewis Act, you have to understand what it is grounded in. And that is our belief in our democracy. I want to thank every single member of the Democratic caucus that have worked so hard to agree on this bill. And I will say the Voting Rights Group, the Rules Committee, and I do differ from Senator Blunt on this. We spent a lot of time making changes to that bill over the year. We have made many changes in response to concerns from secretaries of state and local election officials all across this country. And I also thank you and the president for your leadership. Since this country's founding, when brave patriots rose up and ultimately established a country in the name of we the people, America has been a shining beacon for the world, a touchstone for democracy. We traveled the world as senators, as Senator Shaheen and Portman and I and several of our Democratic and Republican colleagues did just this weekend, when we went to decry dictators and bullies who attempt to undermine democracies, as Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. We were proud on that trip to wear lapel pins with the Ukrainian flag on one side and the United States flag on the other. We are proud of our democracy, and that democracy is fundamentally based on the freedom to vote. Over the years, we've made improvements to address wrongs that kept too many Americans from joining in the rights on which our nation was founded. But generation after generation, Americans have believed that truly in our country's founding promise, that they've fought for it, they've died for it. We are here today against that backdrop of history, at a time when our democracy is facing a new wave of threats, a flood that has surged up since the 2020 elections, when more Americans cast a ballot than ever before as a pandemic raged. And it is up to us to turn back that tide and to preserve the right that lies at the bedrock of our system of government. And again, I disagree with Senator Blunt about what has been going on. I look at the law that was passed in Montana that Senator Tester described. That was set in place for 15 years for same-day registration in the state of Montana. 15 years. In the last election, 8,000 people took advantage of it on election day, either newly registering to vote or changing their address because they moved. It's just taken away from them with what one court described for another law years ago in North Carolina, surgical precision. Or you look at what our friends Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock described of what has happened in Georgia. 70,000 people registered during that last weeks of the election in the runoff period. 70,000 people in the last election. That has been stripped away, passed into law, that cannot happen again. The founding fathers knew that our democracy would face obstacles. A lot of people have been quoting them. I'll quote this one, Samuel Adams. He said this: "The liberties of our country are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks." When you have over 9,000 threats against members of Congress in just last year, double, triple what we've seen before, I don't see that walk we took, that really important walk, that all ended that day. When you have local election officials across this country being threatened, the names of their kids and their homes put out on the internet, like the Republican local election official in Senator Casey's home state of Pennsylvania, his house, his kids, with a threat that said, tell the truth or your 3 kids will be fatally shot. It's on all of us to uphold and protect this democracy. The Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act, meets the challenges before us by establishing basic federal standards for our election, restoring and strengthening the Voting Rights Act, countering the power of secret money in our politics, and taking on new threats to our elections to ensure that every vote is properly counted. And again, let me read from the Constitution, from Article 1, Section 4. That clause empowers Congress to make or alter rules for federal elections at any time. At any time, as Senator Kaine noted, that's the only time at any time is used in the Constitution, at any time. The word filibuster isn't in this document. The word cloture isn't in this document, but it was anticipated that Congress could and should be involved in federal elections when necessary. What brought us to the point today? We're here in the midst of a concerted effort to stop people from exercising the most fundamental right in our democracy. Because, as Reverend Warnock has put so well, some people don't want some people to vote. We're here because the people of this country know what's going on. I'm talking about a veteran in Georgia who didn't have to stand in line to serve his country, but he had to stand. I met him myself. He had to stand in line hours and hours and hours in the hot sun just to cast a ballot. We're here because those voters in Wisconsin who stood in the rain in homemade masks and garbage bags in the beginning of a pandemic just to exercise their right to vote. We're here because of a voter in a wheelchair in Texas who traveled 3 hours on 4 buses just to vote. A woman in Montana who had open heart surgery, uncertain about how to return her mail ballot. A former election official from a rural county who was ousted by Republicans in the Georgia legislature after a decade of service. And a 92-year-old woman who was purged from the rolls after voting in every election for decades since 1968. We're here because after record number of voters voted to make their voices heard, there are people, sadly, that are working in every state capital to make sure it never happens again. And I note that for every one of these laws that have passed in 19 different states, it has been with a simple majority, state by state by state, a simple majority. And then, as was noted by several of my colleagues, after this chamber has established over 160 carve-outs, 160 processes in law to allow for a final vote without a 160 vote threshold, whether it's for the debt ceiling, whether it's for the Bush tax cuts, whether it's for the Trump tax cuts, whether it is for Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 51 votes. Now we hear at this very moment that we must embrace this archaic rule that is not in the Constitution and did not exist when the Senate was founded. And we're not even talking about getting rid of this rule. We're simply talking about restoring the Senate to what it once was, so we can have debates and we can actually vote on bills when those debates have concluded and when the speeches are exhausted. We're here because we took an oath to defend the Constitution as we did that night on January 6th. We're here because we know that the eyes of the world are on us, watching to see if America will stand up and take on the challenges of our time. To paraphrase Dr. King, whose legacy has been honored many, many times today, while there may be finite disappointment in this country for so many people every day, we must never lose infinite hope. We're not losing it. That, my friends, is why we on the Democratic side of the aisle are supporting this bill. With history's eyes on us and with so much at stake, we must and we will fight on. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Madam Vice President.
Majority Leader.
Madam Vice President, what kind of democracy shall endure here in the United States long after our times in this chamber come to an end? Shall American democracy in the 21st century be called a true heir to our framers' vision? A nation where the people choose their own leaders, forge their own destiny, and add to the great legacies of those who expanded the franchise before us? Or shall we see American democracy backslide in our time, grow feeble in the jaws of its adversaries, and ultimately succumb to the cancer of voter suppression? The answer, in a large sense, could depend on how we move forward this evening. As we have clearly laid out over the past 2 days, the laws passed in legislatures throughout the country do nothing less than to discourage and prevent certain kinds of Americans, Black and brown Americans, young Americans, elderly Americans, low-income Americans, from participating in the democratic process. My colleagues, we can begin to put a stop to these attacks tonight by voting to proceed to the final passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These are good bills. These are effective bills, and they should be passed by this chamber as soon as possible. And if cloture is not invoked, we must change the rules of the Senate so we can pass these bills into law. As we cast our votes, I urge every one of us, Democrat and Republican, not to discount our place in history. The story of American democracy is full of contradictions and halting progress. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, you had to be in many states a white, male, Protestant landowner to vote. But ever since the early days of this grand republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws to expand the franchise until there were no more boundaries. Today's vote is the next step in that long march. Are we going to let our democracy backslide in the 21st century? Are we going to be dragged back into the abyss of voter suppression? I urge every one of my colleagues, left, right, and middle, for the sake of our democracy, unite, take a stand today. To every member of this body who treasures our precious experiment in self-rule, to every member horrified by the muck of voter suppression, and to everyone who believes this chamber is still capable of defending democracy in its hour of great need, I urge a yes vote. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746, an act to amend Title 51, United States Code to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into leases of non-excess property of the administration, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746, an act to amend Title 51, United States Code to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into leases of non-excess property of the administration shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Asaf, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Mr. Paul, Ms. Collins, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Carper, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Braun, Burr, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, McConnell, Murkowski, Paul, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, and Young. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Langford? No. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Grassley? No. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Portman? No. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Marshall? No. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? No.
All right. On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President, Madam Vice President, I enter a
Majority
motion
Leader.
to reconsider the failed cloture vote.
The motion is entered.
Madam President,
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I ask that we have order in the Senate. Madam President, Madam Vice President, as we head towards the final hour of debate, I want to just bring us back about 20 feet to talk about the stakes that we are laboring under tonight. I want to talk a little bit about the big picture of why this matters. I know we've changed the rules 160 times in the history of the Senate, but I will submit that it is still an extraordinary endeavor to ask our colleagues to change the rules and traditions of this body. And so here's what I want to say. It is really important to remember that democracy, this idea that every member of our country, every member of the community gets an equal say in the rules that govern us, it is unnatural. Why do I know this? Because I want you to think of every organization in your life that matters. Your workplace. It doesn't give equal votes to every employee as to the direction of the company. Think about your favorite sports team. There's not a vote from all the players about the lineups or the strategy of the team. The Sunday sermon at your church isn't chosen by an online